Australia announced further assistance this week for Ukraine. 30 more bushmasters will be sent to help them in trying to ward off the Russian attack. Joining me now is Assistant Defence Minister Matt Thistlethwaite for more on this. Thanks very much for your time. Ukraine was thankful for the 30 bushmasters, but the other thing they did not get are the Hawkeye vehicles. The Prime Minister said there were supply chain issues. What are those issues and when will they be resolved?
G'day, Tom. Thanks for having me on. With these decisions, we take the advice of the Chief of the Defence Force about what's the most appropriate hardware to be supplied to Ukraine, at the same time balancing, of course, the needs that we have to defend Australia. And the advice of the Defence Department was that the bushmasters and the M113 vehicles that Australia has been supplying are the most appropriate vehicles and the ones that we have enough stock of to supply to Ukraine. So that's the basis upon which that decision has been made.
Surely the latter is the main one. I mean, Ukraine says they're desperate for the Hawkeyes. On that supply chain then, is the issue we don't have enough to spare in Australia, but that will be alleviated down the track? Is that what you're expecting to happen here?
Well, this is something that we're constantly assessing, taking the requests from Ukraine and then, of course, checking with the Chief of the Defence Force and the Defence Department. And their advice was that there were supply chain issues with the Hawkeyes, that it wouldn't be appropriate to be supplying those at the moment. We'll be constantly checking with the Department of Defence on those issues into the future. But I think the point to reiterate is that Australia has been constantly updating the support that we've been supplying to Ukraine, not only the hardware and military support, but humanitarian support as well. And Ukraine has been certainly very grateful. And I think that it also demonstrates that the great ingenuity and capacity that Australia has to produce military hardware, in particular armoured vehicles, and the export potential that they have ongoing.
And so just on those Hawkeyes, just so I can understand this, there is quite possibly spare capacity on the track once they're delivered. Is that what you're saying, that it is still on the table to supply these?
We'll have to wait and see what the advice of the Chief of the Defence Force is about that. I can't give a commitment to that at the moment. That's something that we'd accept the advice of the Chief of the Defence Force on.
But wouldn't you be asking them, what's the, not just now, but if the supply chain issue sorts itself in 6 months, is there then that spare capacity? Wouldn't you be asking that question now so you can, let Ukraine know?
Well, we assess the advice as we get it from the Defence Department, and they've said that at the moment, the Hawkeye is not the appropriate vehicle to be supplying. That's why we've gone ahead and supplied the bushmasters. They've been gratefully received. They're doing a pretty good job over there from what I understand, and we'll accept that advice as it comes from the Department of Defence.
$24 million announced to help veterans transition into employment after they leave. 6,000 leave the ADF each year. I've got to say, I've had a lot of different schemes and announcements over the years. What's the difference here? Is this just some more funding? What's happening?
Well, this is delivering an election commitment. We made a commitment in the lead up to the election that we would support greater veterans employment because we know the great skills and capabilities that veterans developed during their time in the Australian Defence Force. And this morning, myself and the Minister, Matt Thistlethwaite, launched this program in my electorate at Matraville at Bravo Electrical, where we met a number of tradespeople who had finished their service with the Australian Navy and are now working for that business, supplying those skills. But what they needed, Tom, and what was important was that when they finished their careers in the Australian Defence Force, quite often a few veterans will need a top-up of their skills to ensure that they're commercially employable. And this $24 million program provides grants for businesses and for veterans to upskill, to maybe do a couple of extra TAFE courses or university courses to ensure that they're employable in the commercial market. And we saw evidence of that today, and those services are now being supplied to Defence through those contractors and improving the capability of the Australian Defence Force.
No shortage of needs for tradies at the moment in the country. Just want to finish on what's, I guess, an interesting time for UK-Australia relations. things have died down a bit since the second test, but you were suggesting so pompous was the behaviour of some of the English. This is going to drive people towards the Republic. You're being inundated with new Republicans.
Well, I am the Minister for the Republic, so I never miss an opportunity, Tom. But I thought that it did really illustrate, the difference between what that old Britain, that British aristocratic notion that was on display there, and I was quite often on display in the long room at Lords, versus New Australia. New Australia, having moved on, we're no longer British. We no longer sing God Save the King. We're Australian, and we're very much a multicultural nation. And wonderful that that's starting to be reflected in our parliament and in our sporting teams. And you've got people who are performing well, like Usman Khawaja, many of the members of the Matildas tonight that will go around. And that's New Australia. And I think that we can do a better job in representing that in the future by having one of our own as our head of state, rather than relying on old Britain for our head of state.
Maybe changing the anthem really hurt the Republican movement. If we were singing God Save the King these days, I don't know, maybe to give you a groundswell. The PM, though, he might have cursed things here. He tweeted about a week ago, same old Aussies always winning. Since then, the women have lost their last 2 matches, the men have lost their last match. And neither Ashes is assured. So will he apologise to the Australian people if we go down in flames now?
No, never back down, Tom. Never back down when you're supporting an Australian team. I think that, it demonstrates the Prime Minister's commitment to backing Australia. And indeed, many of us are of the same mind. And you saw that when he met with Rishi Sunak at NATO. Always back an Australian, Tom. That's my view. And that's why we should have an Australian head of state. We know an Australian can do the job, so let's back an Australian.
All right. Well, just don't curse an Australian. I guess that's my point. We'll see. We haven't lost yet.
Go the Matildas tonight.
Matt Thistlethwaite, thank you.